You're a Marine. The year is 1945, an unnamed island in the Pacific, one you've come to despise. You're in a foxhole, more like a rain-soaked grave. Tropical humidity, hot steam. Your uniform hasn't dried in weeks. You can feel your skin literally stewing beneath it. Around you, a symphony of hell plays on your frayed nerves. The piercing whine of malaria mosquitoes, oblivious to repellent, the dry, scaly rustle of something venomous in the undergrowth, and the constant ear-pounding anticipation, the click of a sniper rifle, or the guttural cry of a sudden banzai attack. You feel no hunger. You feel no thirst. Your body has shifted into survival mode. All you feel is an endless fatigue, ingrained in your very bones. A state military psychologist would later call combat exhaustion. Home, it's not just a word, it's another universe, millions of light years away. And then, at this moment, when your mind, thin as foil, feels on the verge of tearing, a whispered piece of news passes down the line from one soaked soldier to another. It's not news of reinforcements, not of new weapons, and not an order to retreat. Command has sent you ice cream. Not just a can of icy slush, but an entire factory, a floating factory built of reinforced concrete, costing $1 million in 1945. Today, that is the equivalent of over 17 million. A ship that, every 7 minutes, spews a 10-gallon tub of perfect creamy dessert from its steel depths. It is anchored just a few miles from your island. Meanwhile, on a neighbouring island, in the same mud, an exhausted Japanese soldier with thirst-cracked lips finishes the last. To avoid starvation. This is not fiction. This is one of the most surreal and for a long time secret operations of World War II. It's the story of how the US Navy, relying on reports from military psychologists, built a weapon that didn't fire. A weapon made of milk and sugar. By the end of this story, you'll understand how a concrete ship, which by all laws of hydrodynamics shouldn't have floated, became the most effective tool of psychological warfare, and why this incredible story, so vividly demonstrating American power, was virtually erased from official military chronicles. To understand why such an absurd solution was necessary, you need to imagine yourself in a stuffy field hospital, smelling of carbolic acid and damp earth. A doctor looks at a soldier. Physically, he's almost healthy. No wounds, no fever. But his eyes, they're focused on a point 2,000 yards away. This is the famous 1,000-yard stare, the look of a man whose mind, to avoid shattering from horror, simply pulled an emergency switch. It's a symptom doctors called combat fatigue. Essentially, it's a brain's defense mechanism, shutting down everything non-essential, leaving only phalanxes. He follows orders mechanically, eats, drinks, cleans his rifle. But his spirit is broken, and no amount of rest or encouraging words can fix it. By 1944, this syndrome was no longer an isolated case. It had become an epidemic, a statistically significant threat to the entire Pacific campaign. The war in the Pacific was unlike anything else. It wasn't a war of attrition, but of personal disintegration, brutal without a clear front line in an inhuman climate, amidst venomous fauna and tropical diseases. Standard morale-boosting methods simply didn't work. Alcohol had been banned from the Navy since 1914. Letters from home took months to arrive, and imagine the contrast, a description of a school dance versus the reality of a bloody slaughter in the mud. This only intensified the cognitive dissonance. Soldiers were at their breaking point. Command understood this war could be lost not due to a lack of ammunition, but due to a lack of will to win. The scale of the problem was recognised at the highest levels. Undersecretary of the Navy James Forrestal, a tough Wall Street pragmatist far removed from any sentimentality, wrote a phrase in a memo that was essentially a death sentence for old military doctrine. He stated that morale was the most neglected of all important factors in waging war. Think about it. This wasn't an admission of weakness by the soldiers. It was an admission of a colossal strategic miscalculation by the command itself. The Pentagon had calculated the logistics of shells, fuel and provisions with mathematical precision, but they'd completely overlooked the logistics of humanity. And when a strategic miscalculation reaches such a scale, correcting it requires a conceptual, not tactical solution. It wasn't a new order or a new rifle that was needed. It was a solution that, at first glance, seemed utterly insane, violating the very logic of war. A solution that had to restore not strength, but access to their own feelings for the soldiers. To bring back the feeling of home, this is why a weapon made of milk and sugar was created. Imagine a pentagon, office thick with cigar smoke. Admirals and generals, men who thought in terms of battleships, aircraft carriers and divisions, sat around a long, polished oak table. They were reviewing reports on the catastrophic decline in morale in the Pacific Fleet. And then, one of the officers proposed his solution: build and send a floating ice cream factory to the front lines. A ringing silence fell over the room. Only the clinking of ice in a glass could be heard. Surely some of the generals thought it was a bad joke. The bloodiest war in human history was raging, and they were going to spend steel and fuel on dessert. But the idea was much deeper than it seemed. Why ice cream specifically? Because it's not just food. According to military psychologists' research, it's a powerful psychological anchor. For any American, the taste of ice cream is the taste of childhood, stored in the brain's most ancient parts. The taste of Sunday after church, a first date, a peaceful, carefree life. In the hell of the jungle, where every day was a fight for survival, one spoonful of this cold, sweet dessert could do what neither a chaplain nor a psychologist could. It brought the soldier home for a few precious minutes. It was a tangible, palpable symbol that he was cared for, remembered, and that somewhere far away a world worth fighting for still existed. And this was no cheap whim. The project received $1 million in funding. By 1945 standards, this was a colossal sum. Today, adjusted for inflation, it's over $17 million. For that money, a modern Mark VI patrol boat could have been built and armed. The US Navy, the most powerful war machine in the world, consciously spent the cost of a combat vessel on a dessert factory. This wasn't a quirk. It was a cold, soberly calculated investment in the psychological stability of its army. So the idea was approved, the money was allocated. But one enormous, literally speaking, problem remained. Where to house this factory? It needed a ship. But in a total war, every available pound of steel was going into building destroyers, transports, and aircraft carriers. There were simply no spare hulls in the docks. And so Navy engineers turned to the strangest, most illogical, and seemingly absurd material imaginable for shipbuilding: concrete. At the shipyard in National City, California, workers watched with frank bewilderment. They were building a ship. But instead of the familiar clang of riveting hammers and the clatter of steel sheets, they heard the scraping of rebar and the dull splash of liquid concrete, pumped into enormous wooden forms. Imagine the air. It didn't smell of hot metal, but of wet lime and cement. It looked like the foundation for a skyscraper was being built, not a vessel. Sailors passing by joked grimly that command had decided to build a floating bunker. No one believed this multi-ton concrete box could actually stay afloat, let alone cross the Pacific Ocean. There was no magic to it, only harsh engineering necessity. This was the technology of ferroconcrete ships, which the US had resorted to due to acute steel shortages during both world wars. Such barges classified as BRL, barge, refrigerated, large, had their advantages. They were incredibly cheap and fast to produce, but there was also a huge drawback: they were slow as turtles, unwieldy and completely defenseless. A concrete hull could not withstand a torpedo hit. For active combat operations, they were absolutely useless. But for a floating factory, which simply needed to be delivered to a specific point and anchored in a protected lagoon, it was an ideal, albeit paradoxical option. And here lies the project's main irony. Concrete, a material associated with immobility, pressure and weight. With bunkers, pillboxes, gravestones, a symbol of cold, static defense, and yet this dead, inert material was used to create the most vibrant and warm symbol of home. A ship built of stone became a source of ephemeral joy and tactile comfort. It was a true floating fortress, but it protected not against shells and bombs, it protected against an internal enemy: despair. So the impossible ship was built and ceremoniously launched. The enormous concrete hull, displacing thousands of tons of water, indeed floated, obeying Archimedes' principle. But for now, it was just an empty grey shell, a floating warehouse. The next step was to transform it into the world's most productive and high-tech dessert facility. One had to look inside this concrete leviathan and hear the hum of its machinery. Let's go inside. From the outside, rough, coarse grey concrete. But behind the hermetic steel door, a completely different world opens up. You are dazzled by the bright light of fluorescent lamps reflecting off gleaming stainless steel. You are deafened by the steady, powerful hum of diesel generators. The air is cold and dry with a distinct smell of vanilla extract. Along the sides stretch huge refrigerated compartments, their doors covered in frost. Inside, a strategic reserve, cans of milk mixture, 100-pound bags of sugar, boxes of cocoa powder. In the centre of the deck stands a team. These aren't sailors, rather, they are factory technologists in pristine white uniforms. They are preparing to launch a production cycle that will not stop for a minute as long as the barge is in the combat zone. The heart of this factory, 2 industrial Emery Thompson ice cream machines, gleaming with nickel. Each of these machines is capable of freezing and dispensing a 10-gallon container of ice cream, almost 40 litres, in just 7 minutes. In one 8-hour shift, the barge produced 500 gallons, or almost 2,000 litres, of dessert, and at full capacity up to 1,500 gallons per day. This was enough to provide ice cream to the crews of dozens of ships, or an entire marine division. The barge had its own water desalinators, powerful diesel generators, and huge storage facilities. It was a completely autonomous citadel of comfort. Understand this, it wasn't just a big kitchen on water. It was a full-fledged, high-tech factory operating on Henry Ford's assembly line principles. A small industrial America packed into a concrete hull and sent to the other side of the world. It embodied the American approach to war, even in the wildest, most inhuman conditions, provide its soldiers not only the necessary but also the unthinkable. It was a demonstration of industrial and logistical power that the enemy, forced to subsist on roots and rats, couldn't even imagine. The factory was ready for operation. Its mechanisms hummed in anticipation of the First Order, but the most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead. This slow, defenseless, and incredibly valuable ship packed with sugar and cream had to be navigated through thousands of miles of ocean teeming with Japanese submarines and reconnaissance planes. The strangest logistical operation in naval history had to be organised, the logistics of luxury in the midst of a total war zone. Imagine that journey. Thousands of miles of hostile lead-grey ocean. The concrete barge, essentially a floating refrigerator, crawled as part of a military convoy. Slowly, clumsily, it had no guns, no speed to dodge a Type 95 torpedo. For Admiral Komatsu, as it was sea wolves prowling these waters, it was an ideal fat target, huge and defenseless. Escort destroyers nervously charted anti-submarine zigzags around this concrete iceberg, protecting the strangest cargo in naval history. In its gigantic refrigerated holds were no shells, no aerial bombs. There, in the cold darkness, smelled dry milk, sugar, and vanilla extract. For the supply officers of the Pacific Fleet, it was a logistical hell, grinding their teeth. Every ton of cargo, every cubic metre in the hold of a Liberty-class transport was worth its weight in gold. Supply lines stretched 7,000 miles. They were constantly under threat. And into this well-oiled but stretched to its limit system, an order intruded: ensure continuous delivery of ingredients for the ice cream factory. This meant that somewhere on a humming pier in San Francisco, boxes of cocoa powder were loaded onto a ship instead of boxes of spare parts for Corsair fighters. Convoys that risked everything to deliver blood plasma and ammunition now had to protect a vessel that couldn't fight back. And here, the unthinkable happens, something that breaks all military bureaucracy. According to an order personally signed by Under-Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, cargo for the ice cream factory received A1 priority. Think about that. In some cases, it outranked the importance of delivering specific types of weaponry. Can you imagine the crimson face of a quartermaster on Guadalcanal, receiving a radiogram that precious space on a transport was taken not by new rifles, but by bags of sugar? For many career military personnel, it was insulting, looked like a symptom of collective madness. But for those who understood the essence of psychological warfare, it was a cold, calculated, almost mathematical strategy. And so, having passed through all the dangers, survived typhoons and evaded torpedoes, the concrete barge arrived in the combat zone. With a clang, its anchor dropped into the turquoise waters of Ulithi Lagoon, just a few miles from an island where only yesterday the air vibrated with explosions. Its diesel generators hummed laboriously. A low-frequency vibration ran across the deck as the refrigeration units gained power. Theory was about to collide with harsh reality. What would happen when an exhausted marine, fresh from a bloody mess smelling of rot and gunpowder, saw this floating oasis? And what, at the very same time feeling the taste of hungry saliva in his mouth, did his enemy feel on the neighbouring blockaded island? Let's pause time for a moment. Two islands separated by a narrow strip of water. Two parallel universes. On one side, an American Marine. He's 20 years old. He hasn't slept in 2 days. His nerves are stretched to their limit. He looks at his hands, trembling slightly from residual adrenaline. And into that trembling hand, a cold, condensation-damp paper cup is placed. Inside, a perfectly white, sweet mass. He brings the spoon to his mouth, and in that moment, molecules of sugar syrup and fat explode dopamine in his brain. It's a chemical command. Relax, you're safe. The hell around him simply vanishes for a few seconds. It is the taste of Sunday in his native Ohio. The taste of peace, the taste of home. Archival records testify some soldiers, upon receiving ice cream, simply wept, silently feeling the icy sweetness bring them back from oblivion. Now, a sharp jump cut, a few miles east, to a damp, mouldy dugout where a Japanese garrison sits. Their supply lines are completely cut. The order from Tokyo, steeped in the spirit of Bushido, hold out to the last, but ammunition is almost gone, and worse, food is gone. Japanese reports from those days are a chronicle of slow disintegration. Soldiers eat boiled leather belts, tree bark, rats. Soon they begin to die from a vitaminosis and dysentery. And then the worst happens, what isn't spoken aloud. Documented cases of cannibalism. Despair reaches its physiological limit. Man ceases to be man. He becomes a cornered, hungry animal. And this was no tragic coincidence. This was the calculated effect of a psychological weapon. American command, thanks to intercepted radio messages, knew about the catastrophic hunger in Japanese garrisons. Rumours of the giant barge, endlessly producing ice cream, were spread through leaflets and radio broadcasts. Imagine a Japanese soldier gnawing on a route to survive, and then he learns his enemy is eating dessert. It was a devastating mental blow. This news demonstrated not just military superiority, it showed an inconceivable, almost divine offensive abundance. It undermined the will to resist more powerfully than any artillery bombardment. This surreal project proved to be a dual-action weapon. It supported its own and crushed the enemy. It proved that wars are won not only in the trenches with fire and steel, but also in the minds of soldiers with sugar and cream. It would seem that such a story should be in all military strategy textbooks, become a legend of unconventional thinking. So why today does almost no one know about the strangest and perhaps one of the most effective psychological operations of World War II? Why was this concrete ghost ship deliberately erased from history and simply dissolved in time? The war ended. Millions of soldiers returned home. Weapons went to storage or for scrap. The same fate awaited our barge. Its services were no longer needed. It wasn't turned into a museum like some battleship USS Missouri, on whose deck the surrender was signed. No, imagine that final moment. No cameras, no reporters, just a few sailors on a tugboat cutting the rope. The concrete giant was towed out to sea and simply scuttled. A dull thud against the water. The hiss of air escaping from empty compartments where vanilla once smelled. And then silence. The water closed over the grey concrete. It disappeared, and with it, its story began to disappear. Too, it remained only as brief, almost anecdotal mentions in veterans' memoirs. A funny Navy tale, nothing more. Why? The reason is simple and very telling. The story of the ice cream barge didn't fit the heroic, granite-carved narrative of the war that the nation created after victory. This is a narrative needed for self-identity, like a comic book with only black and white, heroes and villains. There's no room in this comic for grey areas, no room for human weaknesses that are treated with sugar. Because to admit that your invincible Marines could break and need ice cream means admitting their vulnerability. And vulnerability doesn't sell well on propaganda posters. The story of admirals spending millions on dessert diminished the pathos of the great struggle. It turned a part of the war machine into a confectionery factory. It was an inconvenient truth, and therein lies the main paradox. A project that was considered a strategically vital instrument of victory during the war was, after the war, deemed too absurd to enter the official history of that very victory. It was almost a surgical operation to remove a memory, neat and quiet. No one issued an order to forget. They simply stopped mentioning it. In official reports, it was simply called a refrigerated barge, hiding its true purpose. Its real measurable effectiveness was ignored because form became more important than content. The ice cream story awkwardly stuck out from the brutal steel image of the American war machine, and they simply chose to amputate it. But this story is not just a curiosity. By writing this ship out of history, we missed its main lesson. Think about it. What would you choose in a moment of absolute despair? Another clip of ammunition, or a taste of childhood that reminds you who you are and what you're fighting for? The answer to that question is the very lesson that sank with the concrete ship. A lesson about what total war truly is, and that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't what kills the enemy, but what saves you from yourself. So what was the ice cream barge? It wasn't a whim, and not a luxury. It was a cold, pragmatic, and absolutely logical response to an existential crisis. When standard methods of maintaining morale, like letters and movies, were exhausted under the pressure of extreme stress, American command applied an asymmetric solution. They understood that a soldier's mind is as much a battlefield as the beaches of Iwo Jima, and on that battlefield, its own ammunition is needed. The barge was a weapon system aimed not at the body but at the consciousness. It proved a fundamental truth of total war: psychology is no less important than ballistics, and the taste of home, delivered straight to hell, can be more powerful than a bullet. Let's return to that Marine with the cup of ice cream. His personal, deeply human moment of relief, his tears, his momentary return to peaceful life, all of it was part of a huge, soulless strategic operation. His humanity was calculated and used as a tool to achieve victory. His smile was not just an emotion, it was the ultimate measurable goal of a military operation costing $17 million in today's money. There is nothing touching about this. There is only the icy, ruthless calculation of total war, which is ready to turn even the brightest memories into weapons. This is precisely why this story is not about American softness or humanism. It is about their extreme, all-consuming pragmatism, about their willingness to use absolutely any tool, even the most absurd and unthinkable, to achieve a given goal. If victory requires turning concrete into a dessert factory, they will do it. If sugar delivery needs to take precedence over field howitzer delivery, they will issue that order. This story forces us to completely rethink the very concept of a weapon. Anything can become one, even ice cream. In the end, this story leaves us with one question that remains relevant today. In an era of information and hybrid warfare, where the battle for minds has become more important than the battle for territory, what, in your opinion, is a more powerful weapon, a missile aimed at the body, or an idea aimed at the spirit? Cold steel flying towards a target, or an intangible image penetrating directly into consciousness? Think about it, and write in the comments just one word that reflects your opinion: seal or idea.